So as George said, I spent 6 years as a business officer at Alexander Dawson School, just outside of Boulder, Colorado, which is still where I live. And and then I went to work for the National Business Officers Association and continued to live in Boulder because we were a virtual association and we could, and it was a good thing. And ran all of the professional development for MBOA for a number of years. Spent quite a few times in Mohawk doing presentations for quite a few of the NYSAIS groups during that time. And then 4 years ago, took over leadership of MISBO. And we're an association of about 325 schools, primarily in the Southeast, though we now have schools in 15 states across the country. We serve business operations. We are the oldest and first business operations association in the country. We're about to celebrate our 40th anniversary in 2016. Started as a purchasing consortium, and that's still a big proportion of what we do, with about $30 million in revenue that goes through that from our vendors every year. And then we do professional development and webinars and all the other things too. So, and then I think even maybe as important is I've served on the board at the Watershed School, which is a small school in Boulder, for about 8 of the last 11 years that it's been in existence. I served on the Dawson School Board after I was no longer an employee. My daughter was at school there, and did that for a few years as well. I also serve on the board of an organization called ISBC, which is the Independent School Benefits Consortium. So a fair amount of trustee experience, a fair amount of business officer experience, and about 8 years in association leadership in independent schools. And so that's also led to visiting hundreds of schools over the last 8 years and spending a lot of time with schools and doing consulting and programs on board governance. And I think that's when, George and I were talking about things. He thought, oh, well, this would be good. You can talk to these folks about these things. So here we are. So I'm curious now. I can't see everybody, so I was going to have you raise your hands, but just kind of to get an idea, how many of you are CFOs or business officers or whatever your title of schools? So maybe about a third to a half. And then are most of the rest of you trustees? Is that what people are? Okay. So it's a good mix, and I think that's good. So let me tell you what I was thinking about for the next 40 minutes or so, and then we'll do whatever you need to do, whatever makes sense. Actually, George also said, well, if we have time, let's talk about the independent school business model. And I could spend like 4 hours talking about that. So we'll just kind of see how the rest of it goes. And then if we have time at the end, we'll do a discussion. So this is my plan. Jump in, ask questions, talk to me, talk to each other during this. It will, I think, is the best way to do it. I've presented probably now about 150 conferences over the last 8 years, and I much prefer interactive instead of me just talking. So let's do that. And I already asked who you were, but in case you're worried, just a little bit of humor to get us going on this. I love to do this when I have admission directors and business officers together in the same room, because they tend to fight for that claim to fame of having the worst job in the world. I am going to trust that most of you have read the NIS Principles of Good Practice, but I picked out a few things that I thought were most important to kind of start us in this conversation, that I found useful. And so I was just going to go over that. If you haven't read them, then they're all available online at NIS, regardless of whether you're a member or not. And I think they're quite useful. They have PGPs for not just the trustees, but also business officers, heads of schools, and a variety of other positions. And it's a really good resource to look at. But these are the ones I thought. The board is the guardian of the school's mission. I mean, if you just have to describe it, then that's the role. The board and the head work in partnership to fulfill these principles. And then the board selects, supports, nurtures, evaluates, and sets appropriate compensation for the head of school. I think there's one piece missing there, and in today's world it is probably worth mentioning, is the board's also the one that will fire when necessary the head of school. And they don't articulate that in here, but that's the other role, and having been through that as a board member, it's one of the interesting pieces. And then there's the role of the business officer in this, and they don't talk about that directly, but one of the what I use is, I think about the role of the business officer is to translate the mission of the school into its operation, and that's through the use of the budget. And I think, this is where the business officer role with the board and the head of school really is the key element, because it's that translation of the mission to the actual work. So the board recognizes that its primary work and focus are long range and strategic, and I just can't emphasize that enough, that in the board work that I do with schools, almost always dysfunction happens when the board's on an operational level and not on a strategic level. So I think it's really important. NIS also has PGPs for individual trustees. And I think that it's important to understand kind of the role as an individual and the role of the board as a whole. And the other place where I see dysfunction on boards, and you probably know this, is when the boards are primarily made up of parents, and there's not a mix of profile on the board. So the first principle here, the trustee takes care to separate the interests of the school from the specific needs of a particular child or constituency. I think this is where schools get in big trouble, and this is where I think we can actually do something about it. That as an industry, if you will, we haven't been real good about looking at our board profiles and making an effort to make some changes in that, so that they're not predominantly made up of parents. And I don't know about any of you, but as a parent, and as a parent of a former independent school student, and as a board member, I don't know that you ever take off your parent hat. I think that that's always there. And I think if you have a preponderance of parents as trustees, that it's difficult for a board to fully function in a good strategic manner. So that's just my opinion. Trustee accepts and supports board decisions. Okay, trustee keeps all board deliberations confidential, and authority is vested in the board as a whole. Just some things that I think are important for that. And the last one I think is important, because I think in many cases, the other dysfunction that I see is when boards defer to the board chair, and that everything is focused on the board chair, not the board as a whole. So the chair doesn't have any more authority per se than anybody else on the board. They've been elected to a leadership role, but from a fiduciary point of view, it's no different. So something to think about. Questions? Any thoughts? Anybody want to jump in before I move on? I really wish I could. George, is there a way I can see everybody instead of just a few while I'm showing the slides? Do you know?
Well, what you can do while showing the slides is you can toggle through, you can scroll through only seeing 4 people at a time.
Okay.
But there is a back and forth arrow at the top.
Yeah, got it. Okay. All right. Okay. Well, look, now I can see 4 new people. Okay. Well, that's helpful. Thanks, George. Okay. So anyways, jump in and ask questions. As I was preparing and going through these, I found something on BoardSource. How many of you, anybody there, members of BoardSource or use BoardSource for any work? Anybody familiar with that? I'm not hearing anybody, so I would highly recommend that you take a look at boardsource.org and look at some of their resources. It's really quite impressive, and it's all focused on nonprofit boards. And so they have some definitions around some things which we'll touch on as we move into it. But they define the fiduciary role as functioning as a fiduciary means that your board is responsible for the well-being and financial health of the organization. And then as individual fiduciaries, your board members must understand that they may be considered personally liable for their actions and inaction. Excuse me. And I think that those are important aspects as we understand fiduciary responsibility, because I'm not sure that all board members understand that. So I'm going to just real briefly, this is just some thoughts. There's a lot happening, as I've said, with boards and boards dysfunction. And so I just thought I'd just kind of from a strategic level, some of the forces that we're seeing. Board and organizational culture. I mean, this is where most of you know we've seen a lot of leadership transition, and a lot of it has to do with organizational culture. A lot of schools think about, or hopefully think about, leadership transitions for their head of school and other leaders, but maybe not as much on the board level. And so I think that's a factor. Board composition we talked about, organizational life cycle. This gets into accreditation and strategic thinking and a number of other things. So just some factors that are happening in the governance world. You know, I say strategic thinking. I actually don't use strategic planning, and because I don't believe that that's the right language for us anymore. But that's another conversation we can have. But I'm just going to use strategic thinking when I talk. I don't know how big most of your boards are, but on our association, when I first was hired, we had a board of 24. Last year or this year we're at 15. Ideally, I think somewhere between 10 and 12 is probably what we need to function. I know schools that have boards of 35 to 50. I know boards that have boards of 7. There's some literature out there that suggests that an ideal board size is 7. I think it really depends on what is happening at your school and what your needs are. 7 is probably too small for many of your boards. 35, clearly too big. The other questions that arise are how frequently you're meeting. So since, we've got a bunch of, business officers, I don't know how often you're meeting, but I think that it's likely that you could accomplish all of your goals and meet maybe 4 or 5 times a year as a finance committee. And I know a lot of schools are still meeting monthly, and I'm not sure why. I don't know what value that gains. And I think that's something as a business officer that you might be able to help facilitate that change. The other thing that I'm seeing, and again, depending on if your schools are boarding schools or day schools, can change this. But for our association, for example, which is regional, we never have face-to-face committee meetings. They are all virtual, every single one. And we've been using software like Zoom to do that so that we can see each other. But we meet about 4 times a year as a finance committee, and we meet virtually, and we meet 3 times a year as a full board. And we're able to accomplish everything that we need to do. We have 3 standing committees on our board. We have finance, we have governance, and we have what we call an emerging issues committee, which, for us addresses the last point here, which is the environmental scanning. And again, then we do task force if we need something else. So again, trends would be smaller boards, fewer committees, less frequent meeting. Some things to think about as we go through this conversation. Again, questions, comments, challenges, please jump in. Just, tell me what you're thinking. I'm guessing most of you have seen something like this. This is the basic framework of the legal duties of a board: duty of care, duty of loyalty, duty of obedience. I'm hoping that most of your schools have some good board training and orientation that talks about these things. My experience in schools is that a large number of board members do not have nonprofit board experience when they are asked to be in a school board. And that also gets into the role of the business officer and training, because I believe it's essential that that boards are trained on an ongoing basis, but in particular, that new board members are trained on, and everyone, regardless of whether they're on the finance committee or not, are trained on how to read the financial statements, how to understand them, how to read a 990, how to read a management letter, what the audit means, those types of things, because even if they come in there with financial experience, it's unlikely that a new board member has nonprofit, and even less likely that they have independent school knowledge and experience. I mean, that's what I found. And those are the type of issues that can be really problematic. So I'm not going to go through this in more detail, but I think that, the legal duties are really important for board members to understand. Board Source says items to be verified under their legal requirements, or actually they say ignoring legal requirements poses serious risks. Even if your board is not physically filing papers and paying the necessary taxes, it must make sure that these tasks are carried out. Part of the fiduciary role. And so, of course, then it's the business officer's role to do those and then to convey that information to the board so that they're comfortable. And then from a board member's perspective, it says items to be verified include payment of payroll taxes. Now, this is an interesting point I learned a number of years ago, that if board members in general don't have any monetary responsibility, so if everything goes kaplooey, even with their fiduciary responsibility, there's only one place they're going to be asked for money, and that's from the IRS, and that's if the 941 hasn't been paid. And that's the way I understand it. And so as a board member myself, it's one of those pieces. I want to make sure that that's being paid so that we're not ever going to get in trouble. Obviously 990, state and other permits and such like that. So I think it's the business officer's responsibility to find a mechanism to convey that to the board, so that they're comfortable that all that's being done and they can feel comfortable that they're meeting their fiduciary responsibilities. So this is all what we've been talking about. What does that mean? What is the oversight? I think a lot of boards and board members believe that just by approving the budget that they've met their fiduciary responsibility. And that's an important piece, but not necessarily. And then the distinction between the finance committee and the full board. And so this is every finance committee for every organization is going to function differently. One of my rules of thumb, and one of the things I try and actually convey to both business officers and heads of school and board members, is that as a business officer, if you're preparing a report for the board, so even the finance committee, the more detail that you provide, that gives permission for them to ask questions, okay? When you think about that, if your finance committee is getting a full detailed P&L with every line item, then as the business officer, you're kind of asking for trouble, because you're then giving them permission to question what the details are in those line items. And so I prefer, so the head of school should get that. And then some summary report that goes to the finance committee. And then I recommend that even a much more summarized report to the full board. So kind of different stages. And the full board report from a P&L point of view could have as few as 3 or 4 revenue line items and 4 or 5 expense line items. And from a board member's perspective, and having seen every variation, I can tell you that if I'm comfortable with what's happening, that's all I really want. I don't want to know about the pencils in second grade. I just want to know that we're hitting, the key metrics and targets properly. And, you can use dashboards, you can use pictures, you can do whatever you want. That's not really the issue. It's just, what are the key numbers? I want to know, are we meeting our tuition goals? Are we meeting our fundraising goals? Are we in line with compensation? Are we in line with benefits? Are we meeting our debt covenants? What are the key metrics for your schools? And as a board member, especially not on the finance committee, it can be at a pretty high level. And so I think if you take nothing away, that's really a big recommendation I have, is that you try and summarize that to the greatest degree possible. I think I'll stop there for a second and see if anybody wants to disagree with me or tell me how they're doing things or what they've been successful with. Anybody want to jump in?
And if anybody does want to jump in, just again, unmuting your microphone, lower left corner, just click on the microphone icon and we'll be able to hear you.
Thanks, George. Nobody? Okay. All right, George, you need to get them roused up and going here. Okay, well, we'll keep moving on then. But I do think that's an important piece. So let's talk about board roles. I think each school has a very unique culture, and the board culture has to go with that. And I think board members need to understand that, which is one of the challenges of bringing in board members that may not be parents or pretty closely aligned with the school, is because they need to understand that. But I'm sure that all of the business officers listening have had the same experience I have, which is you have a new finance chair, and that finance chair says, I want to see things differently. Let's create a whole new set of reports. Let's change this or that. And this is one of those places where the head and the business officer really need to be aligned with the board to say, well, okay, thank you, Mr. New, Mrs. or Mr. New Finance Chair, but here's the reason that we've done this for years, and here's the ways we've been successful with this. So perhaps you can look at that, because changing that, first of all, you guys all know, is a lot of work. And then changing it again, perhaps 2 years later, when the next finance chair steps in, is a lot of work. So it takes some effort to do that. Anyway, focus on accountability and transparency. I think this is just obvious that as a business officer, you want to be as transparent as possible. And you probably have a higher level of need to do that than anybody else in your school. Because of who you're dealing with. We talked about orientation. Board development is just really an ongoing responsibility. Hopefully your board leadership understands that. In many cases, the head can drive that pretty well, and I think that needs to be ongoing. It's not just, okay, here's your orientation, we're done. I do orientation and training with my board on a regular basis, and we do board development almost all the time. I mean, we only meet live 3 times a year, and it's a meeting it's an 8-hour period over 2 days, and we always devote about a third of that time to board development in one form or fashion. It really depends on what we're working on. So it's just, I think it's critical to success. Okay, real quick on this, and then what I'm going to jump into is the NYSAIS standards. So this is a typical model too of different types of governance. Most boards hope to get to a generative level, and that's kind of the goal, is to keep working, and that's not being operational, being strategic, and then taking strategic to the next level, which is generative, and really pushing forward and thinking about the future. So, that's, if your board's not talked about that and how they get there, that's a board development program. But when I was preparing for this, I asked George to send me the NYSAIS standards, because I think it's important to connect some dots on the work you're doing and how that impacts the standards. And so I think there's 9 of them I'm going to go through fairly quickly, and hopefully, whether you're a trustee or whether you're a CFO or whether you're a head, at some point, hopefully you've read these, and if you haven't, now you'll get to see them. And maybe it'll make George's job easier by doing this. but I thought they were pretty good, George, and so thank you. I remember speaking, we were talking about Lee Quimby, and I helped Lee write the financial standards for Colorado a number of years ago. You know, those of you that have been business officers for a long time may remember that a long time ago, business officers weren't included on accreditation teams. And in fact, the financial standards for schools were pretty lax and pretty rudimentary. And that's changed a lot. And it's changed a lot, especially in the last 7-8 years since the recession and some serious financial crisis. I think it's for the good, because we were accrediting schools that could go out of business because of their finances. And I thought that was a mistake. And that's what Lee and I spent a lot of time talking about when he took over ACIS. So here they are. And again, please jump in. But the administration understands and promotes the mission. So this is my point. You know, the business officer's role is to take that mission of the school, translate it through the budget, and make it happen, right? So the NYSAIS standards, you know, promotes the mission, standards, and policies of the school and provides leadership as these evolve and when they are evaluated. So I think it's a great starting point for the standards for that first one. And then this, I think, is really important. And this has been my mantra for my 8 years of being an association leader. The business officer works strategically with the head of school and the governing body. To me, this is just critical to a school's success, that the business officer and the head of school are strategic partners in the school, and then together working with the trustees, and you know, ensure development and implementation of appropriate policies for long-term management. And again, I'm really glad to see NYSAIS standards really focused on the strategic and the long term, because that is really what's important. So, you know, but again, I can't emphasize enough, and I'm sure there's business officers here that have had situations with heads of school, and will all remain nameless, that the heads didn't truly understand the role of the business officer or the importance of that business officer being their strategic partner in their work. And I strongly believe that that's the role. And I've been talking about it for years and years. This just follows through. Business officer provides important assistance to the head of school in administering the school and governing body in meeting its fiduciary responsibilities. So again, I think it's interesting that NYSAIS looks at this as a standard, that the business officer is right there. And you know, so one of the keys of this session was really about the business officer role. And I think that NYSAIS does a really good job in the standards of articulating the importance of the role of the business officer in leading the school. And again, I won't read them all, but you know, the highlights: safeguarding the value of these assets for use of future generations of students. You know, this touches on the idea from a governance perspective of, if you only have parents of current students as your governing body, it becomes increasingly difficult to focus on the future generations. Because as parents, we're focused on what we want for our children now. And so, you know, this isn't being specific about thinking about your governance model, but I think it does imply that this is a standard, and whatever it takes to get there is really important. The administration ensures that human resources policies and practices are clearly articulated. I was really happy to see this too, because again, anybody that's been in this industry for even a decade or more knows that human HR was not a common position or function in our schools, and that it was, you know, I remember starting, so, well, the head of school and business officer sort of helps, and it's kind of scattered about, and nobody really understands human resources. And, you know, we're large corporations with a lot of employees, and we need great human resources. And this is in terms of a risk where most of our schools are risks. So again, I commend George and his team for recognizing that this is an important criteria. Now, in many cases, the business officer is still the one that's, even if you have a full-time HR person, whether they report to the head or the business officer, there's a pretty close connection there. So I think it's an important role, and I think it's important for the trustees to understand that too. Ongoing professional development, we focus on professional development for faculty, but I think this is a good standard also that they have, that we need professional development for everybody, and it just doesn't, it just needs to be ongoing. The administration and the board employ sound financial planning and management practices. So again, if anybody wants to comment, how many of your schools have plans for tuition that extend for multiple years? I mean, not just a multi-year budget, but true strategic plans for tuition setting that aren't just the next year. If you do, I'd love to hear about it. Most schools I work with don't. Most schools do it year by year. And I think that's a problem. I think we need to be much more strategic in how we look at that. And I think this is what this standard's going towards. Anybody doing real good multi-year tuition planning? Anybody want to admit it or not? I saw a couple of smiles. I'm looking at you guys. Come on. Okay.
Again, the bottom left corner, you can click the microphone icon to unmute yourself, or if you're on the phone, *6.
Thanks, George. So again, I just, these are the kind of things to work. Business officer can help lead the board.
Okay, I could speak.
Please.
We set ours to adjust to CPI. So when CPI goes up 2%, we'll raise up the tuitions 2% unless something's unforeseen.
Okay, so straight CPI increase is what your plan is right now.
Right now, yes. For the next few years anyway. That's the way we're going to gauge it.
That's great. And that was a board / you and the head administrative decision?
Yes.
That's good. That's great. Anybody else doing anything like that? Is everybody else just doing it still year by year? I'm seeing some head shaking. Okay. Something to think about. But are you doing multi-year budgets at least? Projections? 3 to 5 years out? I'm seeing some head shake. Shaking heads is good.
Michelle, did you want to jump in?
Please. Unmute yourself. There you go.
Okay. We do, as our school is quite new, we've been building up our tuition, and I think we're about 2% a year going forward, but we have budgets going out many years, partly I think because we don't have the history of doing it bad the first time. So the finance office is very thorough in their projections.
Great. Great. I mean, I think that...
Sorry, I think Angela might have wanted to jump in too.
Please.
Hi. Yeah, so what we're doing is, because we've had such struggles with enrollment, and where I think we figured out a way to kind of help that and feed through the lower school and the early childhood, but not just looking at tuition. What I'm doing is I'm looking at enrollment first and setting an ideal enrollment model, what we would like our school to look like, from pre-K through 12, and actually moving it through from where we are today through, as the years go on, and how long does it take us to get to that ideal enrollment model. And so if it's going to take us 10 years to do that conservatively, just say, and then applying then, our budget today, and then what needs would we have? Would we need more program? Would we need more FTEs? And building that in, and then also building in a tuition that would work along with what our financial aid climate looks like compared to where we are. So we're not just isolating on, okay, what would our tuition look like? I'm looking at it as a much bigger picture, longer term, that makes sense. It's easy to do models, but if not everything else follows, it's not going to work. So that's how I'm approaching it, rather than just tuition.
That's great. Angela, how many students do you have?
Not a lot. Right now we have 342, and we're pre-K through 12.
Okay.
And our target for this year is 350, and hopefully, and we're feeding through our early childhood program, and it seems to be working. We made some adjustments actually 2 years ago. We had 6 kids in our pre-K, and I did something completely that we're not supposed to do in independent schools, and I dropped the tuition. I recommended that we drop the tuition by almost half in pre-K. And what happened was we doubled and now tripled our enrollment in the pre-K program. And we expect that to go up again this year. And then it's a 2-year, it's a pre-K 3, pre-K 4, and then families can apply for financial aid in kindergarten. So, and that's when the tuition goes up.
That's interesting. So you're not far enough along to understand the retention as a result of that yet, right?
Well, so far we're retaining. In last year, we only lost 1, and this year, so far, it looks like we're losing 1 also.
So that's great. So the evidence so far suggests that that was a good strategy.
Yes, it definitely was absolutely was a good strategy.
Great. Interesting. Anybody else doing anything creative like that? Okay, not hearing anything. That's interesting. Thanks for sharing that, Angela.
Don't tell anyone that we dropped tuition now.
Well, it's an interesting model, and it's an interesting question, especially we see, the rise of different types of independent schools, both for-profit and non-profit, at different price points. And I know New York City's seen a lot of that in various different forms, and almost, I think without exception, they're all at lower price points than the vast majority of our schools. And so I think, considering that is something we need to do as an industry.
Right, but I just want to, it wasn't a shoot from the hip type of thing. There was a lot of analysis involved, a lot of analysis on attrition, what the reason was that people were leaving, why people weren't coming, and also our financial aid environment to see, would we be able to support that going forward? So it wasn't just kind of like, oh, we have to do something. There was a lot went into it before we made that decision.
Yeah, that's great. Good, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Couple other standards, and then we'll move on from there. I think this is just one that most of our schools probably do, but again, it gets into the education and, was there a management letter? Are there things that need to be adjusted or corrected? Who's doing that? How's that done? I don't know so the school board I'm on, so we're a tiny school, Angela. 340 is huge. We have 64 students this year. So you can imagine the financial modeling for us. 1 or 2 students makes a big difference. But along those lines, our finance committee also serves as investment and audit because we don't have enough people to do that. So if you have a separate audit committee, that's great. If you don't, and it's part of finance, that's fine. But I think something I've seen at too many schools and is where, and George, I don't know if this is specific in your standards or if you look at this, but where the audit committee and not the school is responsible for hiring the audit firm and going through that process. Because if you're a business officer, if you're a head of school and you sign that engagement letter, that's not okay. It's got to be the finance chair. It's got to be the board. And I see that frequently as an issue. So following up on that. And then the last one in this section, which kind of touches on something before, but the school has appropriate procedures and personnel in place for accounting for all assets and liabilities, blah, 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 blah. And I think, this is just straightforward stuff. But again, I'm glad to see it because, these are the type of things that if they're not there, you can get in trouble. And as a trustee, those of you that are on the trustee side of this, you should be glad to see this type of standard because this is what helps ensure your fiduciary, meeting your fiduciary role. And so, so really what you're doing is saying to NYSAIS, by having these standards part of the accreditation, then as a trustee, you can feel more comfortable that that fiduciary role is being met. So I think these are good. I was really pleased to see them. I have read way too many different accrediting associations standards, and as George said early on when we were just chatting, the various association accrediting directors get together, and then there's the commission on accreditation. But quite frankly, it's interesting. The commission. This is not George. Are you on the commission?
I'm not personally. Marc Loria sits on the
Marcus.
board.
Well, it's interesting. The Commission of Accreditation has nobody with financial experience on it. And so the financial standards actually tend to get pretty forgotten in that big picture. And I've stuck my nose in a couple times, and I haven't yet been asked to be on it. But one of these days it'll happen. It's a slow process, but you think about this. I remember one of the first accreditations that I was on the committee, and it was in Colorado. I certainly won't name the school, but we didn't even get to the visit, because when I reviewed some of the financial documents, the school was in such serious financial distress due to some not meeting some of their covenants on their debts that I suggested to the executive director of the association that wasn't even worth doing a visit, because until these were fixed, the school was in danger of bankruptcy. Now, this was a while ago. This was prior to 2008, but it was still a situation that was startling to me as a business officer, going, wow. And but that was not uncommon. And so I'm really glad to see good financial standards. And again, as board members, I think you should be happy to see them. So a couple other things, and we'll have a few minutes left if we want to talk about the financial model, or we can just have questions about this. One of the things that Board Source says, and I think that this is actually where our schools do the best, is Board Source says if the board is not involved in approving the annual budget, it is neglecting a major aspect of its fiscal responsibility. Now, I've never seen that happen. I've seen it happen at various levels, from way too detailed to very cursory, but at least it's happening. The Finance Committee should work closely with the Chief Executive and/or Chief Financial Officer to reach a mutual understanding of the year's financial objectives, as well as to create a physical document to guide the staff in making decisions. So it's multifaceted, and I think that those are pretty good guidelines. Another thing that Board Source says, which I found also fascinating, I was working with NBOA in 2008 when the financial world crashed around us. And I remember talking to schools about a variety of different challenges and issues. And one of the ones that came up had to do with reserves. And many of our schools had good reserves, and they were really questioning the whole, about what to do about tuition and raises and, compensation and stuff. And I said, well, what do you have in reserves? And they would tell me. I said, well, that's pretty healthy for a school your size. What are you doing with it? Well, nothing. I said, well, why do you have it? And so the whole idea about having reserves and having policies around it and actually using them when appropriate, I think is something schools don't do well. So Board Source says planning for the future without building any reserves is not smart financial planning. For years, I consulted with schools, and they were always happy to have a balanced budget and a zero at the bottom. And I said, where's the money for your reserves? Where's the money for your future? And in so many cases, there wasn't any. And I think that's been changing, and I'd like to encourage schools to think about changing that. So just a couple last points, and we've got like 7 minutes or so. I'm happy to talk about some thoughts I have on the financial or the business model of schools, but I'm also happy to just talk more about this and listen to your thoughts and answer any questions. So why don't we see if anybody has any to start?
Well, people are thinking about questions. Let me just respond to 2 questions you asked that relate to NYSAIS and membership requirements and accreditation. One of the things that we're experiencing here in the state as a result of the Nonprofit Revitalization Act of 2013 is a recalibration of the guidelines and requirements for board audit committees. So we'll be doing a future eSeminar on that very topic of the Act, but that's something that's very familiar to finance officers around the state, and if it's not, it should become the details of that should become very familiar to you, because there are some new requirements for the independence of trustees and who may serve on an audit committee and who is not able to serve on an audit committee. And some of it gets to those issues you were talking about with parent trustees and people, whether they're invested in some of those decisions, and setting tuition and that type of thing. And then the other thing I wanted to mention too, Mark, is that it's not legally required for our schools to have management letters, but it is a member requirement of our association. So in addition to the annual audit, we require that all of our member schools have a management letter drawn up by the auditing firm to give them information to make decisions at their school about how the process is working. And it's also required for accreditation.
Great. Great, thanks. That's helpful. Yeah, one of the, I mentioned the watershed school where I serve on the board. I am not and have never been a parent. And one of the reasons I agreed to help them, besides the fact that I believe in the mission of the school, which is my first and primary reason, is that they made a commitment that 50% of the board would not be parents. And they've kept to that pretty well. So it's a much more functional board than many I see. And that was one of the reasons. Other thoughts? Anybody want to talk about their board profiles? How they're working or not working?
I have, and this is Matthew Boone. I have one question. Our board meets every month from September through June, and it's way too often. But how do you tell the board chair? I mean, how do you let the board know that they should meet, 2-3 times a year less often than they do?
Well, I think that it starts with, and what's your role? Are you at the school or are you the?
I'm CFO, yeah.
Okay. So the conversation has to start with your head of school, first of all. And I think that's a conversation from the head of school to the board leadership about, the goals for the board for a year. So this is actually a great time of year to be thinking about the subsequent year and having a conversation. Okay, as a governing board, what do we want to accomplish? And the head, which is the role I play as an association executive, is a very similar role to a head of school. I'll sit down with my board leadership and say, what is our goals for the year? And we've already done this as the MISBO board, and we've already actually set our meeting schedule because it was all integrated in. And so, but to start with it is, and then look at the minutes for those monthly meetings, and maybe, look at them really critically and say, what did we really accomplish governing work during that time? Did we do good strategic thinking? Are we governing in a generative manner, or are we diving into operational issues? And if we're diving into operational issues, which is almost a certainty if you're meeting monthly, because it would be next to impossible not to, then by meeting less frequently, we can actually raise the level of board governance to a strategic generative level. But it really depends on the relationship, in this case, I think, between your head and your board chair to start. And this is one of those board developments. Maybe it takes somebody from the outside to talk about board governance and what does it mean to be a generative board. And here's the feedback I hear from my board. And I'll just give you some real quick background. The MISBO board, before I got here, was an operational board. They literally ran the association. And in fact, in a 40-year history, there was only one executive director before me. And so we had to transform how this board worked. And now the feedback I hear from the board member is, it's the best professional development I get. I look forward to going to board meetings because it's fun, it's interesting, it's educational, it makes me think at a level I don't get to do all the time, and on and on. And so, the upside of shifting your board governance is actually getting a stronger board. So again, I don't know your head, I don't know the relationship, but that's where I would start. It's a great question. It's hard. And then that flows through to your committees. And what do you need to accomplish? Look at, do you have for instance, we developed charters, so basically mini mission statements for each of our 3 board committees, so that they knew what their mission was for the year, and then they set goals for each year. So, you know, we approached it in this very methodical pattern to change our culture. It takes time. It's a great question.
We have a question from Stephanie, which is, how long are each of your 3 board meetings?
Each of them run because we're regional and because most people have to travel, we schedule them to start at noon on one day, and then we go about 4 or 5 hours, and then we'll do something social. We'll start the next morning at about 8 o'clock and finish by noon, and that way people can, in our case, because of the location, people can travel in the morning and get to wherever we are. They can travel in the afternoon when we're done and get home. So we spend about 8 hours or so meeting each of those 3 times. So not insignificant to do that. It's a great question. And then the next part of the question is our committees meet between 4 and 6 times a year, and they generally meet for no more than an hour for each of those times. So when we look at total board commitments, that's what we're asking of them.